Bring them in so we can get ourselves started.
Countries that most people have never heard of.
The food will be there, and the extra wine and beverages and beers will be there when we're through to continue, I think, correct? Yes. Right.
We're here till 6 o'clock.
So we're here till 6 o'clock. Got a lot to do. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming in on this nasty sort of fall day. We're still not in winter, and we are the fall term. Anyway, good afternoon, and welcome to ScholarSip. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Danuna Tetsky Bean of Libraries, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to our fall 2019 ScholarSip event. This is beginning our 9th year. ScholarSip was launched in 2011 as part of the library's strategic goal to connect Drexel faculty and professional staff to scholarship. As a social setting with food for thought discussions about cross-disciplinary research, the tradition also builds community, which is one of our key objectives. So each year the event gathers colleagues from all colleges, schools, and many administrative departments who join together to toast the end of each academic term. We are also recording and streaming this event live online for our colleagues off campus, and I believe I'm extending a warm welcome to 3 people who are online, who are joining us virtually. So we're glad to have you here as well. So I hope that each of you who are coming in online also have something good to sip while you join us. We'll provide the scholar, but you got to provide us. We haven't yet come up with the technology to just transmit that across the internet, right? There's some things that are good in person. So the theme for this year's ScholarSip series is University and Industry Research Collaborations. During each quarterly event, a distinguished Drexel faculty professor will offer food for thought on the benefits and challenges of conducting and disseminating research when academics collaborate with industry. Together, we hope to explore different motivations for conducting research and different requirements for sharing, preserving, and utilizing research output. We have some exciting speakers lined up this year, including today's thought provoker, who I will introduce in a moment. In March, we will look forward to hearing from Professor Banu Honore, some of you know pretty well, from the Drexel School of Biomedical Engineering. Science and Health Systems. Continue that full title. And that will be at our Winter ScholarSip event. So save March 16th, 2020. I believe it already 2020, the next decade, for the next ScholarSip gathering. And now I'm pleased to kick off the 1920 series with the 2019/2020. We're not going back to the roaring 20s, 1900s. Series with our guest speaker, Professor Michelle Lowry. She is the TD Bank Professor of Finance at the LeBeau School of Business and the Academic Director of the Raj and Kamla Gupta Governance, I get that right?
Yep,
Governance
perfect.
Institute. She received her PhD from the University of Rochester and was previously a professor at Penn State University. She's also a past visiting professor at INSEAD and at the Wharton School. Michelle is currently an associate editor of the Journal of Financial Economics, a past associate editor of the Review of Financial Studies, and a founding member of AFFECT, the Academic Female Finance Committee, which strives for gender equality among the field of finance academics. Michelle's research focuses on a variety of issues in empirical corporate finance, including initial public offerings, mergers, and corporate governance. Her research is published in top financial journals, including the Journal of Financial Economics, the Review of Financial Studies, and the Journal of Finance, as well as the popular press, with mentions in news outlets including the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and NPR's Morning Edition. But before I turn the podium over to Michelle, let us continue our scholarship tradition yet another year and toast the end of the fall term. So here, it's the last day of classes. Those of you who have to go back and grade, be kind. Let your students have a nice holiday. So here's to the fall term. Cheers. So thank you, Michelle, for serving us a unique food for thought.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that very thorough introduction, which
essentially means I could skip the first 2 slides, which tells you who I am, but I'll try to go over them briefly. And thanks so much for the invitation to do this. This was fun, sort of putting this together. Like I said, at the risk of a little bit of repetition, who am I? Broadly speaking, I am a TD Bank professor, the TD Bank professor of finance. So I spend a lot of time in just sort of purely academic mode, doing academic research, trying to publish in academic journals. But the other hat that I wear is being the academic director of the Gupta Governance Institute, which means I spend a lot of time interacting with people in industry, a lot of different people in industry. And I'm a big believer in those interactions. Anybody that's talked to me knows that one of the things I'm very passionate about is, as academics, I feel like we have a real obligation to share our knowledge with industry. And exactly at the same time, I think we as academics need to remember how much we can learn from industry. That's a two-way communication street. And that's a lot of what my presentation is going to focus on here. So a lot of the work I do, the end result is not a single paper where I'm one author and somebody from industry is one author. Rather, it's a case where I'm an author along with another academic, but that end product, that end article that we observe is really the result of a lot of back and forth conversations between academics and industry. And I'm just going to sort of talk about that broadly. And then I'm going to go through a few examples, hopefully not too tortuous, from finance, because I think examples really tell the story of how this has worked with just a couple of my projects to kind of convey the point. So for better or worse, that is where I am going. Like was mentioned, I'm also a founding member of Effect. This is something I'm very passionate about, issues related to gender. And, this is another case where I've learned so much from industry. So one just quick anecdote here. We founded this organization about 5 years ago. It now has about 500 members. It's worldwide. And Cornerstone consulting firm came to us and said, could we please host your reception at this year's annual conference? And I said, sure, of course, please do, write the check, which they happily did. But then I was sort of like, well, why? And they said, one thing we're hearing more and more from judges is they want more female expert witnesses on the stand. And so that was what they, and so again, just these conversations, I just think you keep learning different things. And that's been a very fruitful relationship, and a lot of things are being done on that front. So again, in research-wise, what do I do? Most of my research is focused on young companies, so typically around the time they go public in an IPO. And the other main theme of my research is corporate governance, so things like companies' boards of directors. How do we think of that balance of power between shareholders, the investors in the firm, and management? And that gets into a lot of sub-issues, but big picture, that's what I tend to work on. My approach towards research, if I was going to summarize it, and this was interesting to force me to summarize it as I put these slides together, how does it tend to work? Every paper is different, but I think this is a common theme. So I talk to people in industry, as I said, and frequently through my role through the Governance Institute, I have a lot of conversations with people. A lot of stories, right? The one thing industry people have are lots and lots of stories, and you can learn so much from those stories and so much institutional detail. And then I go back to my office and I think, wow, that was really interesting. Is that just a one-off, or is that more interesting? I sort of spend all this time looking into it, and I start thinking about the economics and the data. And this is where an academic can come in, right? So industry people have this story, and we have the ability to provide systematic evidence on a large scale to see, is that story just a one-time thing, or is it a broader phenomenon? And that's really something that summarizes a lot of the papers that I do. And sometimes it's a one-off. Sometimes I spend, a few days looking into something and I can't find a single other company that ever did it. And well, that one gets put aside. But more often than not, there's something more going on. And then we gain through this systematic evidence, first seeing how large scale a particular phenomenon is, and more importantly, understanding the why, right? That's what we as academics are after, is the why. And again, spend a lot of time thinking about that. And then we can come back to industry and share that insight And that tends to, many of my articles have been covered in the popular press. I serve on panels frequently, networking events, etc. So the knowledge kind of comes full circle. And that's, to me, is the model that I'm after. So what's the value add? So when I tried to think about it, the question has to be, what does industry have that academics don't? And what do academics have that industry doesn't? Because if there's going to be a partnership, both sides have to gain, right? If only one side is gaining, then you're not going to get buy-in from both. So what does industry have? War stories, anecdotal evidence, institutional details. Lots of it. What do academics have? We have us sitting in front of our computer, plugging away, right? Getting this systematic evidence. Hopefully, less of a bias towards one finding, right? So academics have increased credibility, and I think that's something that we can advertise, right? We don't have kind of skin in the game towards producing one certain finding. So hopefully, there's more faith in our findings. So we can learn from each other. But it's not easy. We speak very different languages. At least for me, I could walk into a room. I walked into this room today. Until Mike walked in, I knew not a soul here. I find it incredibly easy to talk to any academic. Even in somebody in a different field, you kind of speak this similar language. Somebody in industry, not always true. Industry person, what are you working on? Me, blah, blah, blah. Industry person, I get one of two answers. Yeah, I already know that. Or, no, you're wrong. I just worked with one company and it didn't work that way. Oh my God, right? So the frustration and how do you overcome this is something I continue to work on. I probably don't need to convince you guys a certain phenomenon might exist on average across a large sample. That doesn't mean it's going to be true 100% of the time. Again, this is why it's easy for me to talk to people that are sitting in this room, but not other people. We can learn from large sample evidence. It's a communication challenge. It continues to take practice on my part. I do feel like I'm getting better, but I also try to give myself a lot of pep talks. They tend to be necessary. It doesn't come easy. So with that being said, so when I thought about, generally speaking, how do I think about this? I think that's my general. But I thought it might be, hopefully, interesting to go through a few examples from my own research. So I kind of randomly picked 3. These are 3 questions that I've looked at in recent papers, hopefully not too in the weeds finance. Who provides financing to private companies? Who provides financing to public companies? And are investors paying attention to their portfolio companies? So it's kind of broad questions. Let me talk about the first one for a minute. So who provides funding to private companies? So the commonly held view, which you will get if you read any industry publication, sit through an MBA class, et cetera, the answer is venture capitalists, angel investors, banks. These are the types of entities that fund private companies. In contrast, mutual funds, we know what mutual funds buy, right? Probably a lot of people in here have some money in a mutual fund, and they invest in public firms. And so here's just one quote from Investopedia, pretty widely used internet search. Mutual funds pool money from the investing public and use that money to buy other securities, usually stocks and bonds. And I could find numerous other quotes to the same effect. But then I was reading the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, 4 years ago, suggested otherwise. Title of the article, Mutual Funds Flail at Valuing Hot Startups Like Uber. So Uber was private at the time. This is 2015. And this article is saying what? It's saying that BlackRock owns Uber, and they're valuing it at $40.02 per share. Vanguard owns Uber. Hartford Growth owns Uber. Fidelity owns Uber. And I'm like, wait, what? Wait, what are all these mutual funds doing owning private firms? Now, notice that wasn't the title of the article. The article is, why are these mutual funds valuing these private companies at different prices? I'm like, wait a minute. Let's back up. Forget why they're valuing them at different prices. Why are they owning them at all? I was sort of pretty confused. Why is this the case? Is this beneficial for mutual funds? Are they learning from this? Is this beneficial for the underlying firms? Why do they have mutual funds buying them instead of venture capitalists? And where do I even start trying to understand this? Because I didn't even know it happened until I was just reading this article. And so again, this is where I feel like I can learn a lot by reaching out to industry. So I reached out to mutual fund managers, I reached out to private companies, I reached out to venture capitalists. I just spent a lot of time on the phone. And every person I talked to, I got the name of another person that I could talk to. And I just sort of kept having these conversations, learning more and more. I collected a bunch of data from the SEC. The end result is an academic publication. The article focused on documenting the trend, the implications for the underlying firms, the implications for the mutual fund investors. But the hypotheses, the empirical tests, all of them were developed based on these in-depth conversations with industry experts. So I start with the industry. I learn a lot. I then sit at my desk. I do all this in-depth analysis, collect a lot of data, really spend time thinking about it. And then the popular press is really interested in our findings because, remember, it started off with the Wall Street Journal knowing about 4 instances. We collect all the data. Our article got lots of coverage in the popular press. So this is our data. And where they're showing the number of mutual funds that are doing this, it's not just these 4. You've got 97 mutual funds that are investing in private firms. And we spent a ton of time digging into this. $8.1 billion invested in this space that really wasn't known up until that time. 40% of VC-backed IPOs had mutual fund investment before going public. And again, like I say, no surprise, this got a lot of coverage in the popular press. So it's a great example. So, stay private longer. What does the paper show? That mutual fund investors show that companies can stay private for 1.5 to 2.5 years longer than otherwise. So that's the benefit to the underlying company from these investments. In valuation of $8 billion, up from $16 million in 1995. So very, very large valuation numbers. So again, what's the bottom line? It was one Wall Street Journal article. That's me learning from industry. And then me reaching out to a lot of other people in industry to learn more, and then putting everything together and documenting it, and then sharing that knowledge back again. That give and take is how I think about academic research. 2 other examples. So number 2, who provides funding to public companies? So the commonly held view, like I said before, is that VCs, angel investors, et cetera, they provide funding to private companies only, not public companies. Here's a quote from one of the primary MBA textbooks on venture capital. A VC invests only in private companies. A VC's primary goal is to maximize its financial return by exiting investments through a sale or an IPO. But while looking through the data, we discovered that's actually not the case. About 15% of companies, after they go public, are getting more financing from VCs. It directly contradicts the quote that's in one of the most widely used MBA textbooks. So again, okay, that's interesting, but what am I going to do with it? How do I even go about starting to understand? The same way I do everything else. I interacted with, one of the first person I called was a private equity lawyer who's on the advisory board of the Gupta Governance Institute. I said, what's going on? Why are they doing this? I called some directors of private firms, some executives, and this case was interesting. So most of these people had exactly one view on this practice. About half of them said, yeah, this is great, and the other half said, this is terrible, they're just investing in their friends' companies. But that's not large-scale evidence, right? Those are stories. It's the one-off. I want to know bigger picture what's going on, but their stories help me to frame the hypotheses and the empirical tests. Again, the value of academic research is to provide this large-scale unbiased evidence. again, it's now a forthcoming article, and it's been covered in a number of different outlets, one of them being the Columbia Law School's blog that's read by a lot of industry experts. And finally, one last sort of story. My third question, how attentive are investors to portfolio companies? Every company, every publicly traded company is required to have an annual meeting where they have various agenda items up for vote. Mutual funds are required by law to vote their shares. So my question is, well, if you have to vote, how much attention are you paying? I mean, do you vote in your local, I don't know, for a senator, congressman, president? How many of those votes do you pay a lot of attention to? Probably some you pay a lot of attention to, some you don't pay much attention to at all. Some people just vote the whole ticket, some don't. Same kind of idea here. Do they vote resources to researching the proposals? Do they not? So what did we do here? We got super detailed data, and this was a really fun project. Through the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, we figured out that we could go into the SEC's website, totally publicly available, and we could see if Vanguard was viewing the proxy statement of Apple Company on January 31st at 3:45 p.m. That's the level of detail we could see. We could see exactly what mutual fund was looking at what company filing at what point in time. So there you go. We got these great pictures. So exactly how much attention is Vanguard Group paying or Fidelity? I can draw any picture you want. I can show you exactly what they're doing. But then, of course, people have all kinds of concerns that I won't, sort of bore you all with, but they have all kinds of stories where maybe I'm not getting this right. Maybe I'm capturing something that I don't think, maybe it's a bot, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Every time I present, I've got all these different things. So, what can I do? So I presented the paper, I submitted and got accepted to present the paper at this University of Delaware conference. It's a great conference because it's a mix of academics and industry practitioners together. And so the audience included all these current and past employees from exactly the firms that I'm showing these data from. Result, so first they were like, oh my God, you can see this? That was a little frightening for them. Once they got over that, they confirmed a lot of my findings, so that was reassuring for me, right? So then when I go out and present more, I can say, well, yeah, they confirmed that's the case. They also suggested, though, a lot of other tests, things that they would like to know. They were like, wow, well, if you can tell me, like, I'm from Vanguard, I know I look like this, so why don't you tell me something about what all my competitors are doing? Like, I'm kind of curious about this. And they had all these different questions. And they also put me in contact with a whole bunch of other relevant people. So, you meet some people, you talk to others, et cetera, et cetera. It's been a really fun project. So anyway, what's the bottom line for all this? I really think about research as an iterative process. I think that if given the type of work I work on, and certainly it's different for people in different fields, but for the type of work I do, if I just sat in my office and didn't reach out and didn't talk to these other people, I think I would get it wrong. And in fact, I have one short anecdote. I thought maybe I shouldn't put this on the slide, so I'm just going to read it off my phone. This is a quote. I am reading off a text here. This is from an acquaintance of mine that works in the for a large company. I'll leave it at that. The text reads, "Do you know this paper?" with a link. "Do you know these people? They do not seem to understand anything about our industry." And I wrote back, well, I haven't read the paper yet, but these are really well-known people in academics. And then the person wrote back, wow. That's what I don't want somebody writing about my research, right? I don't want to get it wrong like that. And it's easy to. There's a lot of institutional details out there. How do you get it right? So the way I do my best, and I'm sure I've gotten it wrong sometimes, but I try conversations with industry, frequently one-time stories, anecdotes. That leads me to analyze, assemble large data sets, many firms, and then share the preliminary findings with both academics and industry, and then I revise and frequently repeat. And that's my bottom line. That's how I collaborate with industry. It's never me and an industry person on a paper, but certainly the voices of industry are there both as a sanity check and to provide insight at many steps along the way. And that is all I have to say. So thank you very much.
Open for questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know if people have questions. I'm certainly happy
Do you have
to.
any online, any comments?
We have one online. Do you want me to do that first?
Yep. So as you're raising it, do speak loudly so our online folks can hear you too.
I wonder how you can find such data, mutual funds, companies, VC, etc. Is it public information from a subscription database? Thank you, a very informative presentation.
So first of all, thank you for the question. It's a combination. So the data on that I showed you that were graphs of Vanguard and Fidelity, those data are largely, about 90% of them are all publicly available on the SEC website. And certainly if you wanted any other additional information on that, send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions in more detail. Other ones are largely subscriptions, but they're subscriptions that Drexel has access to. So they are data that are available largely through Thomson Financial.
How would you get to that if we didn't subscribe to it?
To Thomson Financial, if we didn't subscribe? So when we're considering a project where we don't own the data, we'll frequently contact the data vendor to get some information on what's available, to get an idea of pricing. We then ask for a small excerpt of the data just so that we can see. One thing that I've learned painfully is data vendors tend to promise, 157 different variables and 1 million observations, and 155 of those 157 observations are only filled in for like 10% of the data. It's very frustrating. So I now specifically ask, for year by year, what percent of the observations are populated for each different data item I'm interested in. And it's a back and forth. A lot of times we're able to negotiate on the price and get a somewhat lower price. And more, at least in finance, there's data that you can just scrape off the internet for free. And so I confess, embarrassingly, I don't have this skill set, but I'm smart enough to find co-authors that do. So that's been a way around some of these really expensive data subscriptions. So you do have to be careful to not violate anything. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Really, thanks for the talk.
Oh, sure.
You mentioned at the beginning that we can all speak to each other as faculty,
Yeah.
or staff and others and university people. I'm in the history department, and a lot of the way you describe your research is historical. Mm-hmm. And I was curious about if you think of it in some ways that way, getting stories, narratives from people in the industry and finding context for them is very much what we would do. And more specifically, we have a new collection here at the library called the Schramm Collection, which is going to be opened up over the next year, which is a local Philadelphia company that's been operating until recently for the last 125 years or so. And thinking about how to maybe collaborate along in that way to work through like skill sets that you and your colleagues have, and what historians might do to understand context 100 years ago. So I just wonder about that historical perspective in your work. Do you think of it that way?
I absolutely do, and I wish this was my paper, but one of my favorite papers of all time is written by a friend of mine, and what he did is he looked at it's very historical in nature, that's why I mention it, the different expeditions from Europe to explore the New World, and about 50% of those, give or take, were privately funded expeditions, and 50% of them were public expeditions. And he used it as a very out-of-sample test for the sort of benefits and advantages and disadvantages of publicly funded goods versus privately funded, and had some just fascinating findings. So there are cases like that where I think that there are lots that we can do with history. There's other papers in finance that have looked at, for example, whether CEOs grew up in the Great Depression and what's the influence of that on your character, or have used the Dust Bowl and the effects of the Dust Bowl on the region, the area, and how the economic development was, and et cetera, et cetera. Those are a few anecdotes. So my quick answer to your question is absolutely. I think that there's lots of opportunities to do some fun things there. Yeah.
Sounds like
Thank
a
you.
seed for collaboration.
I'll be emailing.
So when you said that the mutual funds are interested in small firms, I'm thinking, well, that's in general all small firms or mainly in these IPO firms? Because I'm thinking now probably the startup firms still going to merge with the angel fund instead of the mutual fund, because mutual fund, they want this security for sure.
That's right. No, it's a good question. So the sort of slightly more detailed part of it is that under regulations, mutual funds are allowed to invest up to 15% of their value in what's called restricted securities. And private companies fall under that sort of set of restricted securities. So what we see is mutual funds investing in the type of private firm that would hope to go public one day. So they'll be less likely to invest in. So, for example, Wegmans is a private firm, but they're not on, at the moment, a track where it looks like they will go public. I mean, they might someday, but that's not the trajectory that they're on right now. And I'm not saying there's none, but I personally have not seen any mutual funds invested in Wegmans. But on the other hand, there were a lot of mutual fund investments in Uber and Airbnb and, unfortunately, WeWork. But that's another story. So it is definitely a selection effect there. Yep. Yeah.
If a private company doesn't have shares, how do they invest in that? Like
Right.
Wegmans, how do you get to invest in Wegmans?
Yeah. So private is sort of a very common misconception. Private companies do all have shares. They're just not publicly traded shares. So even if, I always give the example, so let's say you were going to start a restaurant and you started the restaurant just with $10,000 of your own money, that's effectively one share. And then you go to your, say, brother, sister, whatever, and say, hey, I need another $10,000. Do you want to invest beside me? They put in $10,000 too, and there are now 2 shares of that company. You might not call them shares at that point in time, but that's effectively what it is. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
That's a question and a comment. So I'm a chemist,
Okay.
and it was interesting to see kind of the parallel in structure and anecdotally my interactions with people in fund
Oh, is that
service.
right? Okay.
So a lot about stories.
Yeah,
People
very
have
much so.
an incredible wealth of information that they've collected over the years.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the data, they're very unwilling to share any data because of intellectual property.
Yes.
But they want the same kind of outcome. They want to know what are the general trends that you see from this kind of data. So from my own experience, I wrote a review several years ago about a particular functionality. Think of it like a flavor.
Okay.
In drugs, and what does it do? And going to people in industry, they were very willing to say, well, if you look at our competition's patent, you can see what it does there.
Oh, really?
And then what they saw as the value was the ultimate publication came out and said, this is what it does as a trend in these kinds of compounds. So it was the same thing.
Very similar, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is definitely interesting. There are a growing number of databases in finance that we benefit from where, just like you say, frequently individual companies don't want to share their data. So, for example, in the case of venture capitalists, no venture capitalist wants to say what companies they're financing. They want to keep that information private. But there's, call it an aggregator, where all the different venture capitalists report confidentially to this one, and then they aggregate the data, and the benefit is if you volunteer your information, you get to learn everything about everybody else. And so these sort of industry standards that have developed over time, we as academics have benefited from in finance. But it's interesting, definite parallels, yeah.
I was thinking about the mutual fund investment.
Yeah.
And are you able to parse out whether it's individuals who have mutual funds who are then selecting to invest their own money?
It's not. It's at the mutual fund level.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's the mutual fund manager that is choosing to make that investment, and we can see that on the SEC filings.
Darn, because I was hoping for advice.
So, Michelle, we talked a little bit about this before. So
Yeah.
let's bring this, but
Absolutely.
your research output from this type of work is stories, they're narratives.
They're narratives, yeah.
How do you, and you're committed to sharing your
Yep.
output.
Yep.
How do you steward that output? How do you organize, manage, preserve, or have you given thought to it if you're not yet, of capturing those stories as source evidence for future research that someone else might want to, how do you record those different discussions and stuff and then use it?
Sure, absolutely. So, the first source is going to be the actual article, which is published. So it's published in an academic journal. So if you have a subscription to that journal, which, being a member of the university community, you would, that's the narrative, right? So those are very available, even for people that don't have the subscription to the journal. Within business, there's a website called SSRN, and everybody posts their research there. So it's very kind of publicly available that way. And in fact, the first article that I talked about, it was just honestly amazing. The one on mutual fund investments in private firm, we posted it on SSRN at the end of the business day, on whatever day. The next morning, and I wake up early, I opened my email and had an email from a Wall Street Journal reporter that wanted to talk to me as soon as possible. So these guys are monitoring this very, very carefully. In terms of the data, sorry, let me just give the second part. In terms of the underlying data, there is a growing initiative in economics and finance. There's growing concerns about, I can never say this word, whether results are replicability, that. So there's growing concerns about that. And so there's been pressure from the journals to share underlying data where possible, to share code, et cetera. And so all that underlying data is frequently available as well through the journal websites. So that in terms of the actual article, sort of those are the two sources. And then the final thing, and then I'll come back because you look like you have a follow-up question. The final thing is, whenever possible, I do try to serve on industry panels or just talk to people as a way to keep that dialogue open. I don't know if that...
And that is a great emerging model that the journals
are
taking some responsibility. But how would we, for example, be able to leverage the fact that you're a Drexel faculty member, and your output is partly representation of what goes on at Drexel?
Yeah.
So how could we find that if we were not, to find your source data so that people in Australia might be looking for it, but might not think of it directly related to your article? Is there a way that people might find that source?
At least within the business school, I think this will answer your question. In the finance department, all faculty keep their personal websites. And so if you go to, if you Google Michelle Lowry Drexel, the first thing that should come up is my website, and then it has everything. So if you clicked through, you would find it. And that's certainly very, very linked to Drexel that way. You have to know, you'd have to know it's Drexel. I don't know if I have a better answer than that.
It's an interesting challenge, right?
It is, yeah.
How do you enter this larger global world of scholarly communications where the source data now is an equal important output that may shape future research that others are doing based on that, whether they're coming at it for the same purpose or totally different reason?
Well, I just learned about some history data that I need to get my hands on, so.
It's something to talk to you further about.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Okay, any other questions?
Well, maybe we can
Okay,
continue
well,
over a little bit
thank
more.
you
Thank
very much.